I think the hardest part of the 2-week wait is that your body is full of progesterone. You are thinking about every symptom, and that high progesterone symptoms are just the same as pregnancy symptoms. And I remember when this was happening to me, I was obsessive about tracking my cycles. I should have bought stock and pregnancy tests because I took so many of them. And every little twinge, symptom, I read into it. So the emotional challenge of the 2-week wait really comes from the lack of control. The better you know your body, the easier it's going to be for you. So if you are driving yourself crazy or constantly thinking about your symptoms in the 2-week wait, you're not alone. Welcome back to the As a Woman podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Crawford, and today we are talking about one of the most emotionally charged parts of the fertility journey, the 2-week wait. Whether you're trying naturally or it's an IUI or after IVF, those days between ovulation or treatment and pregnancy testing can feel endless, and the anxiety, hope, and stress can truly take over your life. In this episode today, we're going to unpack what actually happens in your body during the 2-week wait, why waiting feels so hard emotionally and physically, how pregnancy tests really work and when it makes sense to take them, and practical strategies to get through the wait without losing yourself to constant worry. So if you've ever Googled early pregnancy symptoms at 2 a.m. or felt like time just stopped after ovulation, then this episode is for you. Well, friends, when we talk about the 2-week wait, I have a lot of personal experience in this. Before we dive in, if you don't know my own story, I had 4 pregnancy losses before I had my own 2 children. And I felt like I became a master of cycle tracking, thinking about every single symptom, and really trying to figure out what was going on inside my body. So when it comes to the 2-week wait, it really is what is happening in the luteal phase and trying to differentiate in your body what's different if you're pregnant versus what is actually normally happening. So let's think about the 2-week wait in general. We remember that every month when you have your period, you're going to have a group of eggs that starts to grow, and one of these eggs is going to mature. Each egg grows in a follicle, and this is the follicular phase. Well, that follicle is going to rupture, allow the egg to be released, and this is ovulation. And after ovulation, that follicle is going to reform and become the corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is a cyst inside your ovary that's perfectly normal, but it is now a hormone-making factory. It is making mostly progesterone. And what's really important is that it makes progesterone in pulses in response to LH pulses from the brain. So the brain is sending out the hormone, luteinizing hormone, in pulses up and down. This corpus luteum is then going to make progesterone in pulses. And what is going to happen is you're going to have a variation of your progesterone level throughout the entirety of that luteal phase. But as compared to the follicular phase when your body has no progesterone, this is now a phase where progesterone is predominant. The corpus luteum is really essential for implantation and for early pregnancy. Progesterone itself opens and closes that implantation window. And without progesterone, you can't get pregnant. In fact, an old study looking at monkeys, they actually took out the corpus luteum in pregnant monkeys and they miscarried. This is because in that time period before the placenta is fully grown in, the corpus luteum is making all the hormones for the pregnancy. So when you're having fertilization and implantation, thinking about your symptoms really thinks about what is happening to the egg, to the embryo, at which time of your cycle. So the corpus luteum typically lives about 2 weeks if you're not pregnant, and that's the standard length of the luteal phase. The egg is released from the ovary and captured by the fallopian tube quite immediately. It then must be fertilized within 24 hours. So that egg has to be fertilized, and that's why we recommend that if you're trying to get pregnant, that sperm is there before or on the day of ovulation. But the egg doesn't immediately make it into the uterus like you might think. Once it's fertilized in the fallopian tube, it actually stays in the fallopian tube and grows and develops for the next 5 to 6 days. Going from a single cell, which is the egg, into a multi-cell ball called a blastocyst. And this is 300 to 500 cells by the time that it reaches the uterine cavity. So it's growing and dividing across the course of that fallopian tube until it reaches the uterus. And so during this time period, you may be pregnant, yet there's no implantation. So there's no signs to your body that this is happening because the embryo is moving along. It is not making any hormones that can be detected by your body because there's no connection to your body. So this means that first week, essentially, of the luteal phase Even if ovulation occurred and you did in fact get pregnant, fertilization happened, that embryo is still hanging out in your fallopian tube, and the only signs and symptoms you might feel are those of increased progesterone. So progesterone in general is the progestational hormone. This causes you to feel fatigue, breast tenderness. You might notice you've got some brain fog. You might be hotter. Your core body temperature rises. We remember that because if we track our body temperature, we notice a rise in temp after progesterone is now being produced. And you also might notice that you're feeling more depressed or moody and generally just having a slowing of your metabolism. It's trying to get you to slow down so you have energy reserves to be pregnant. That's progesterone, one of its jobs. So what is happening during that first time period, the first week after ovulation? You're simply having just progesterone-like symptoms, and you're probably, like me, thinking about every single symptom that may be happening in your body. But there's no utility in checking pregnancy tests in this time period because there's nothing to check. Now, once that embryo arrives in the uterine cavity around 5 to 6 days after ovulation, now we can start to implant into the uterine wall. And this is really fascinating to me. So the uterus has its own blood supply, its own vasculature. And if we think about what's happening with the placenta, it really has to come and lock in and connect with the blood supply of your uterus. And so it has to first adhere to the wall, and then it's going to bury itself in and start to make that blood connection. Well, the embryo itself does make a specific hormone called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. And HCG is also known as the pregnancy hormone. When you take pregnancy tests, or if you go to a clinic and they draw your blood, this is the hormone that they are checking. Well, HCG is really fascinating, but as the embryo is growing and dividing, it is making more and more HCG. And HCG is a good representation of normal embryo growth. So we like it to approximately double every 2 days. So at this time period, HCG is doubling every 2 days. And what's so fascinating is that HCG and LH share a receptor. So HCG combined to those LH receptors on the corpus luteum, and now your body's gonna chug out even more progesterone. So think about the corpus luteum there. It was making progesterone in these pulses up and down in response to LH from the brain, and now suddenly HCG is rising. So now you have a constant and increasing stimulus once that embryo is implanting in, and you have a rise stimulating more and more progesterone production. This is why the early pregnancy symptoms are truly just the exact same symptoms of very high progesterone production. So now your progesterone is really rising, and what you are seeing is that the progesterone is causing some of those symptoms to be more severe. So you might notice that you're really feeling some of the moodiness, you might be hungrier, more tired, have that fatigue, want to take a nap. All of the progesterone symptoms also sound really similar to PMS symptoms, the luteal phase, because they're due to progesterone, not due to the pregnancy itself. Well, these symptoms continue as more and more HCG is produced into the early pregnancy. And this is when a lot of people start thinking that they might notice some of those pregnancy symptoms. I know for me personally, it was a weird sensitivity to smell, which when you have higher progesterone, you might have an increase in hunger, but you also might have food aversions, nausea, but a sensitivity to smell. And the thought historically is that this might protect you from certain foods that have a higher risk of being contaminated or harmful if you're pregnant. But I felt like I could suddenly smell everything anytime I was pregnant, even if it was before I had missed a period or gotten a positive pregnancy test. And even with my son, checking that pregnancy test, the reason I checked one was because I suddenly felt like I was smelling everything. So these symptoms might really start to be very, very strong. And this might be when you could detect a pregnancy on a urine pregnancy test looking for that HCG. Before we dive into pregnancy tests a little bit more, I do think it's important to touch on progesterone one more minute. So you will see a lot of people talking about low progesterone, and you might hear people talking about checking blood levels to see if your progesterone is adequate or not. I think it's important that you know that in the luteal phase, progesterone can range anywhere from 3 to 40 nanograms at any moment and be totally fine. Because why? It's responding to those LH pulses from the brain, and you don't really know when you're checking it. Well, once you're pregnant, we really should have a constant stimulus of progesterone, and you'll see varying levels, but we really want to see that more progesterone is being made. And levels over 15 are consistent with a higher likelihood that it's a good or a normally dividing pregnancy because the pregnancy is making enough HCG to stimulate enough progesterone production. And truly, we're really talking about as you get towards the time period when your brain is no longer sending out LH. So at the end of that 2 weeks. So you should have this higher progesterone production. And if you are drawing blood with a pregnancy test, there's different levels. So in fertility treatments, for example, if I'm replacing or supporting you with progesterone, I often will check a level and I might change the dose of progesterone because I want to get it to enough. This is a little bit different because often in fertility treatment, we are modifying how your body's ovulating. You may or may not have functioning corpus luteums. And in the case of a frozen embryo transfer, for example, we're replacing all hormones. Your body's not making any. So we really have to make sure that we're giving you enough progesterone to get those high levels that the pregnancy needs. And that's why we often give you IM or intramuscular progesterone, because we want to make sure that levels get high enough in some of those frozen embryo transfers. So the difference in what happens normally, what happens if you might be supporting or supplementing progesterone, and what happens in IVF or fertility treatments, it's really different, but we're trying to mimic what should be happening in nature. So I think that's an interesting observation. Anytime we talk about progesterone, I have to say I'm seeing a ton of people who are being put on daily progesterone for something called estrogen dominance. This means they had blood work drawn, estrogen was higher than progesterone, and they were diagnosed with estrogen dominance. Remember, your body is naturally estrogen dominant at many times, and so this might be a very normal time period. For example, in the follicular phase, or depending on when you checked this in relation to when an LH surge happened. Never take daily progesterone if you are trying to be pregnant because it's birth control pill. Specifically, do not take progesterone before ovulation has occurred. And because progesterone opens and closes the implantation window, we're so specific about when we start it in cycles when you are ovulating. We want to make sure you have ovulated and that we're not artificially giving you progesterone before your body would normally make it. So again, progesterone is going to go up and down, but once implantation starts to occur, typically that's going to be days 7 to 9. You're going to really start to see that increase in progesterone production due to the production of HCG from the embryo that is implanting. And if you are going to be checking a pregnancy test, that in theory could be the earliest you might see a positive. I think the hardest part of the 2-week wait is that your body is full of progesterone and you are thinking about every symptom, and that high progesterone symptoms are just the same as pregnancy symptoms. And I remember when this was happening to me, I was obsessive about tracking my cycles. I should have bought stock and pregnancy tests because I took so many of them. And every little twinge, symptom, I read into it. If I had cramping, if I had breast tenderness, if I felt nauseous, could I be pregnant this month? And was I pregnant enough to stay pregnant? So if you are driving yourself crazy or constantly thinking about your symptoms in the 2-week wait, you're not alone. But I do think it's important to think about how pregnancy tests work and to make a game plan for the 2-week wait, because it feels sometimes like you're on a hamster wheel doing the same thing over and over. And I know that can be extremely frustrating, in addition to just emotionally and physically challenging. So urine pregnancy tests are ones that are detecting urinary HCG. When we do blood pregnancy tests in the fertility clinic's office, we're checking HCG in your blood. Now, blood tests are always going to be more sensitive, meaning we can check and detect lower levels of HCG. On the urinary-based tests, there's a few different ones out there. How they work is that HCG is released into your bloodstream. So the embryo is making HCG that goes into your bloodstream. It's going to get metabolized and has to get processed through your kidneys to get into your urine. And what you're doing is these are urinary tests. So a pregnancy test, you urinate on it on the strip, and then your urine sample moves along and there's a control and a test line. And so if there's any HCG, it's going to bind to that test line. Now, pregnancy tests can be digital, and they can also be ones that are a line of some form or fashion. Typically with the line ones, you'll have a control line, and that will either be a straight line or some markings that will say control. That one should always show dark, and if it doesn't, the test may not be working correctly. The test line, however, is not like an OPK. Remember, in an OPK or an ovulation test, which is checking the LH hormone, because LH is present all the time, we need that test to be as dark as the control or greater to be accurate. But for a pregnancy test, any line, any sign at all, even if it's extremely faint, is a positive test. And just to give you a little bit of insight in how much this can vary, because in clinic, we do urine tests and blood tests all the time. We can see a very, very faint urine test, and you still might have a very high HCG level. That's because there's so many other factors that go into the urine about when it was metabolized and how dilute or concentrated your urine may be. But any line at all is a positive pregnancy test. That's a really important thing because I will have people tell me, oh, it was just light, so it wasn't really positive. But that's not how it goes. That test is not positive unless you have HCG in your body. The one thing I always think is really important here, especially for people who might be doing fertility treatments, is that if you had a cycle that got a trigger shot forces ovulation to happen. It is actually a high dose of HCG. So remember, because HCG and LH bind to the same receptor, if I give a high dose bolus of HCG, it will cause you to ovulate just like a surge of LH does. And why do we give HCG? The short answer is we don't have an isolated LH compound that we can give you. That's why if you're doing fertility treatment and you need some LH to grow your eggs, you take FSH that's isolated, and then you take a hormone called Menopur, which is a combination of FSH and LH isolated from menopausal woman's urine because both FSH and LH are high in menopause. But we don't have an isolated LH. So when you get a trigger shot, you're going to take a big HCG shot, and that's going to cause ovulation to happen. But that means your pregnancy test might be pregnant well earlier because of it. And I think that's something that we have to be aware of. This means you need to wait even longer to take a pregnancy test if you used a trigger shot in your cycle, or you have to do something called testing out your trigger. The idea for testing out a trigger is a lot of pregnancy tests. So please do not do unless you are crazy like me. But what you would do is you would take your pregnancy test every day and you would watch the HCG line go from positive to negative because we know it's going to be positive from the HCG. And then once you get to that negative value and the trigger shot is out of your body, you then, if you see another positive, will see the line get darker. In perfect practice, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes you just perpetually stay positive. It might get lighter and then darker again, depending on when implantation is actually happening. So I just think that's important to know because I've had some people call and say, I have a positive pregnancy test at day 6 after my trigger, and it's really just the trigger. For most people, it does take about 6 to 8 days to get that out of the body completely. Now, if we are checking a pregnancy test, when can it detect that you're pregnant? This depends on the test manufacturer and how sensitive they have made the control in the test line. So in most pregnancy tests, standard is that you have to have an HCG level of about 20 to 25 MIUs per ml in order to detect a positive. Well, some of these early tests, now you're going to pay more for them, but you might notice if you go look at your pregnancy test on the counter, some that say early results, earliest test you can take. These have a lower HCG cutoff. So they actually are more sensitive. So if we see that, their cutoff is usually at 10. So you will be able to detect an earlier pregnancy with one of those early tests. So if you are somebody who wants to check early, those are going to be the tests that are more likely to be positive for you. In the same breath, if you are going to be waiting to test, there is no reason to spend your money buying a more expensive pregnancy test when the regular one will do the job just fine. So when do we recommend that you actually take a pregnancy test in the 2-week wait? Well, embryo is entering into that uterine cavity again, typically around day 5 to 6. And we generally say that implantation window is in the big range, days 5 to 9. I typically say it's more realistically probably days 7 to 9. But essentially a week after ovulation, you're going to be at the place where the embryo is going to start implanting and HCG can start to be produced. And then that HCG is going to approximately double every 2 days. So we typically want to give it a few days to get to a high enough level to see it in your urine. The perfect time to take a pregnancy test, if you want to know for sure, I want to take one test and I want it to be positive or negative, and I want to trust that result, would be 2 weeks after ovulation or the day that you would expect a period to come if you are not pregnant. And that's why a lot of people will say, wait until you've missed your period, because that way you might not be wasting money on tests or you might not be obsessing over lines ahead of time. But in the vast majority of normal pregnancies, you will get a positive on a urine pregnancy test before that 2-week mark. So if you are tracking, you can start to take one earlier. I typically don't recommend taking a pregnancy test before about 9 to 10 days after ovulation at the earliest. I know some people take them earlier, but it can be negative and you can still be pregnant. Remember, HCG has to get into the urine, and then depending on other variables like how dilute or concentrated it is, you may or may not see a positive or negative. So I usually would say day 9 to 10 is a good point. The earliest I would ever say is typically day 8, unless you are testing out a trigger or doing fertility treatments and somebody gives you different recommendation. I will say it's important to know that when we do an IUI, we're doing this on the day of ovulation. So essentially 2 weeks from an intrauterine insemination is when you should check a pregnancy test. But if we're doing an embryo transfer, it's a little bit different. So when we put the embryo into your body, if we have a blastocyst embryo, that embryo is at day 5. You're essentially 5 days after ovulation already. And so we check pregnancy tests typically about 9 days after that because we're already 5 days in. Also, if you had a day 3 embryo transfer, which is not nearly as common anymore, but it could be, you would see that a pregnancy test is typically checked about 10 or 11 days after that. So what we are doing is trying to still check based on when you would normally miss a period because we have got standard levels of what blood HCG should be around that time. Now, if you are getting blood levels drawn in this 2-week wait, what's a normal HCG level? We really like it to be around 100 at that 2-week mark after ovulation. That's a really nice, reassuring number. Even more than 150, even more reassuring. Anything over 50 is truly a good number, and it is okay. Levels less than 50, though, have a higher likelihood of not progressing normally. With that being said, I have had people have perfectly normal babies whose HCG started out extremely low with very well-known dates, meaning we know exactly when we put that embryo back in the body. I've seen HCG levels as low as 7, 9, and 11, all make it 2 perfectly normal babies. So if you are going through treatment and you do get a blood HCG and it is a low value, don't let that convince you that it's never going to be and make some decision that could be harmful. Notably, don't stop your progesterone unless your clinic is telling you to. Typically with those low levels, we tell people we're going to be really cautious here. This is not quite as high as we want it to be, but it doesn't mean we're out of the race. We want you to continue your medications, continue your progesterone, and we're going to repeat it in 2 days to make sure to see that it is doubling appropriately. And if it does not, then we will stop your medication and see if this pregnancy can resolve so we can get on with another treatment cycle. Remember that progesterone is supporting that early pregnancy. And this is why there's always that chicken and egg hypothesis, because a normal pregnancy growing and dividing makes more and more HCG. That is going to stimulate the corpus luteum to make more and more progesterone. An abnormal pregnancy is not growing and dividing normally. It is not going to stimulate as much progesterone. This should not be enough to support a pregnancy and is the sign to your body, this pregnancy is not going to make it. You're a human and can't be pregnant 100 times. So we're going to miscarry this pregnancy and try again with one that hopefully will grow and divide normally. So the relationship between progesterone and HCG and miscarriage is actually pretty complex. But if you are on progesterone from a clinic, it might delay when you're going to bleed, and it might be keeping a pregnancy that's not normal from bleeding or miscarrying. And that's why your clinic might tell you to stop it if the HCG levels are not rising appropriately. So what do I recommend that you do? I think number one, if you're trying to get pregnant, and especially if you have infertility, it's really important to think of a game plan. The social aspects, the emotional aspects of the 2-week wait can start to feel very overwhelming. So let's dedicate extra time to taking care of ourselves because our body is worth it. So think about stress coping strategies, number one. What are you going to do for you every day? Think about this before you get into the 2-week wait. Are you going to go on nightly walks? Are you going to journal, meditate? Are you going to go to counseling? Are you going to go to acupuncture, do some yoga? What is there that you can carve out that makes you feel better, that can help alleviate some of your stress during this inherently very stressful process? I also think it's important to protect your peace. Even though we want to be involved in our friends' lives and do everything we can, this might be a time period for you where you say, I'm not going to go to that baby shower, or I'm going to send a gift instead, or I'm going to mute one of my friends' texts and get back to her after. It's okay to know that you might not have the emotional bandwidth for everything that comes at your way. I also think when we think about work too, if you've got a big project, maybe try to work on it more earlier in the follicular phase, get more of it done. Try to have fewer deadlines in the luteal phase or the 2-week wait when you know it's going to be more stressful. Because that's what the 2-week wait is, right? It's really just the luteal phase. So we're trying to navigate strategies for coping with our luteal phase when we are in fact trying to conceive and we could potentially be pregnant. I also think a strategy for your pregnancy test is important. I think that if you can wait until you either have a change in your symptoms, so they go from normally elevated progesterone to, oh my gosh, this is more. Now I'm having really bad fatigue, brain fog, breast tenderness, nausea, lack of appetite, sensitivity to smell. These symptoms are now changed. Now I'm going to take a pregnancy test. That's one approach. The other is wait until you had your 2 weeks from ovulation, take a pregnancy test then, or say, okay, I am going to take early pregnancy tests. And so these are the ones I'm going to buy. This is when I'm going to start testing, and be okay with your plan. Meaning, don't take 3 pregnancy tests in a day. Find a time of day that's going to be good for you. Maybe it's not your first morning urine because maybe it will distract you all day at work, and it'll be better to check in the evening if you're checking early. Also, if you're going through fertility treatment, your clinic is going to want to draw a blood level most likely. So are you going to test at home early or are you not? Either way, please do not stop any medications unless your clinic is instructing you to do so. We do not want you stopping based on a false negative. I see false negative pregnancy tests much, much more than false positives. And the majority of the false positives that I see are due to people who actually are testing when they had a trigger shot in their body. So plan distractions, think about a stress strategy, talk to people in your life who can support you. Maybe this is your partner, maybe this is your best friend. Bring them into your world if you feel comfortable so they can understand what you're going through, and have a strategy for testing pregnancy, understanding what is going on in your body. The 2-week wait is a time period that can be really emotional and really challenging. The last thing I want to say is that we can sometimes have spotting in the 2-week wait, and this really can drive you crazy. Spotting in the 2-week wait can be due to that implantation. Remember that the placenta is invading the uterine wall. It does this by sending out enzymes that are going to eat away at the side of the uterine wall so that it can make that connection. This might cause some spotting. So just because you have spotting in the luteal phase doesn't mean you are out of the game. Similarly, that process can be painful. It can cause uterine contractions or cramping as a placenta is invading in. So I will sometimes see people who say, oh, I had some spotting and cramping, so I stopped my medication. I stopped my progesterone. Again, that's not what we want to do. Your body, if you are becoming pregnant, is going through something that's going to be a major change, both hormonally and physically. So sometimes spotting or that cramping can be a sign that normal placental invasion is happening. And I know for me, this was so painful, especially the 2 pregnancies that were perfectly normal became my kids. I was shocked at how the cramping was quite intense, and I was convinced I was going to miscarry those pregnancies, but really it was just the placenta invading and growing in. So the emotional challenge of the 2-week wait really comes from the lack of control. The better you know your body, the easier it's going to be for you. So make sure that you're tracking your cycle. You know when ovulation really happens. You have a game plan for how to cope with the 2-week wait or the luteal phase, and you think about what your normal high progesterone symptoms are so that you can identify some of the other ones. If you're under fertility treatments, don't make any big changes in your medications without your clinic's guidance. And if you are checking pregnancy tests, make sure you're not checking them too early or in urine that is too dilute, because you might get false negative results. The most sensitive time to check a pregnancy test, that it will be the most accurate, will be that 2 weeks after ovulation, but most people will get normals earlier than that if you're wanting to check. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember that this is covered extensively in the Fertility Formula, which is available for pre-order now. The Fertility Formula is going to go over facts I wish you knew about your body, all about cycle tracking, trying to conceive, and navigating infertility, and then really talking about how inflammation and lifestyle impact your hormone levels, your fertility, and your health, and gives you an actionable plan for what you should do. You can find out more at nataliecrawfordmd.com/book. And with your pre-order bonus, you can also get a hormone lifestyle guide and access to the IVF course. So thank you so much for being here. Ask questions so that we can cover more and you can learn about your body. Thank you, friends. Thank you for listening to the As a Woman podcast. If you're ready to take control of your reproductive health, my new book, The Fertility Formula, is your next step. It's a science-backed guide to understanding your hormones, optimizing your fertility, and owning your reproductive future. You can order your copy and learn more at nataliecrawfordmd.com/book. And as always, follow along at Natalie Crawford MD for even more support. Because knowledge is power, and your health deserves a formula made just for you as a woman.